Welcome to the lecture, everyone. Today's agenda is an introduction to image processing applications or computer vision applications. We will be looking at image acquisition, we will be looking at image representation, and we'll be looking at some challenges in image processing. Why is image processing a difficult problem? And we will understand this by looking at certain sample applications or sample problems. In this lecture, I'm going to divide image processing applications into three parts. One set of image processing applications are where the input is an image and the output is an image. The other set of applications are ones where the input is an image and the output is text. And the third bunch of applications are where the input is an image plus some human generated stimulus or human input, and the output is typically 3D graphics. So let's look at some of the early applications where the input was an image and the output was also an image. This is essentially image enhancement applications and image compression applications. There could be many more, but the two really big areas were image enhancement and image compression, and these two continue to be very important areas in computer vision and image processing. So if you look at image enhancement, this is the process whereby you could take an image and sort of make some of its properties better for human perception. So what do we mean by human perception? What do we mean by making an image better? So for instance, if you look at this image, this is an old photograph, and in fact this is something that Kodak used to specialize a lot in. So if you take your old photographs into a photo studio, you have these old photographs which are disfigured or discolored slightly. If you take these printed photographs, right, in the olden days we never used to have CCD cameras, we would have printed photographs. If you took these printed photographs to a photo studio, they would be able to take the printed photos, scan it into some machine and enhance the image, right? And these were some very early techniques in image processing that were consumer facing. Right, and people really loved it. People really loved to enhance their images, make them appear brighter, especially if these are images related to your memories, right? Old photographs, photographs of your childhood, wedding photographs, and so on and so forth. And it's a big area, and it continues to be a very important area. Even forensics, satellite image analytics, analysis of agricultural images, analysis of medical images, they continue to use a lot of image enhancement. So if you are taking a satellite image, sometimes the image could be blurred because of weather changes. So when you take a satellite image, if the air that is between the ground and the camera is essentially the satellite, which is hundreds of kilometers if not more above the surface of the earth. So the atmosphere that is in between the surface of the earth and the camera, which is the satellite, can lead to certain deformations of the image, right? And these deformations or these errors on the image can be removed by using image enhancement algorithms. So it's very common in satellite imaging to use very specialized image enhancement algorithms. Similarly in forensics, image forensics, where you have bits and pieces of an image, or you have surveillance videos which are not high resolution surveillance videos. If you want to increase the resolution, or if you want to remove certain things like shadows from the surveillance video, image enhancement is again very useful, right? Similarly, agricultural image processing. If you are doing either agricultural or medical image processing, where you need to get details from an image that is not having sufficient resolution, you may also want to turn to image enhancement. So this is a very, very big area of image processing. There's still ongoing research, but it's one of the oldest area of image processing and computer vision. You also have image compression, which is another very big area where the input is an image and the output is an image. Image compression really took off when the web started to become very important, and even before that it was very important. Imagine you have again satellites which are taking images, right? Now these satellites might need to communicate the image back to the ground station. If you do not have image compression and you send the image at the original resolution, the image might be too large, it occupies too much memory. So the bandwidth required to send the image from, let's say, a satellite to a ground station would be exorbitant. It would be too significant, and therefore the cost involved and the time taken for doing the image transmission would be too much. And this is a problem that became more pronounced when the web arrived. So you had hundreds of thousands of people watching videos, you had many people exchanging photographs over email, over the internet subsequently, when you have social media becoming more popular. So scaling or downsampling or modifying the image to get a compressed or a more memory efficient representation of the image became very popular, right? And this was because of various reasons. You required people who were interested in different parts of the image also, right? So let's again go back to this nice problem of satellite imaging, right? In satellite imaging, and this is something that you might look at in some of your programming assignments, where let's say you get these large images and you are interested in only parts of the image. What could be efficient ways of taking the entire image, dividing that into parts and transmitting only some of the parts? This is an important problem, even pathological image processing. So in pathological labs, certain types of microscopes take images with very high resolution, and the doctor who is examining the image may not be interested in all parts of the image. They may be interested in looking at only some parts of the image. So can you take a very large image which is probably thousands of pixels by thousands of pixels and take only certain parts of the image and transmit it, or transmit the entire image at very low resolution, but when a user selects a certain portion of the image, display that to the user at a higher resolution. So image compression was another very important area in image processing. It went from designing image compression algorithms that solely focused on ensuring perception and bandwidth saving to more complicated applications that were interested in parts of images. So let's look at a simple example to see why this is very important. So if you look at this image, right, this is a compressed image. So for example, you can see that this is a high resolution image. So this is a book, and we've just taken a photograph of the book, and you can see that this is very high resolution. This is a slightly lower resolution or a compressed form of the same image. So you can read all the words. You can see that this is third edition, so these words are also very clear. Similarly, the words image processing, analysis and machine vision are also very clear here. But you can also read the author names very clearly. But when you go to this image, which is much lower resolution, a very highly compressed version of the original image, you can see that many of the details are lost. You can still figure out that this particular compressed form is the same image as this, but you cannot really read the details of the words, so you cannot figure out what is this, right? If I showed you this, then you can say, hey, this is third edition, but by itself you cannot read this. Similarly, the words or the names of the authors are not readable. Obviously this text is not readable, right? So as you decrease the resolution or you decrease the quality of compression, right, if you compress the image too much, this image will have much lesser size. It will occupy very little memory as compared to this image, but it is also missing the details. So what you want is a balance between the two. You don't want very high resolution because you will take too much memory. It takes a lot of bandwidth to transmit the image, but you don't want to lose all the details as well. You want something that's in between. So you can still perceive the image in very good quality, but you can also save on the transmission cost. Now, why is this challenging in this decade, like right in the 21st century, when you have super resolution, when you have very high bandwidth, when you have optical fiber cable all the way to your house? Why is this problem still very important? Consider certain applications, like for example, video transmission, right? Everyone these days is very common with Prime Video, which is Amazon's offering of distributed video. Everyone is familiar with YouTube video, and there are many other applications where you can watch videos online. So when you are, for example, watching videos on Netflix or Amazon Prime or YouTube or any of the other popular applications, and let's say you have a HD TV and you're watching very good resolution videos. If your bandwidth suddenly drops because of whatever requirement, because the backhaul becomes clogged up with a lot of content, or a cable breaks in your neighborhood, let's say you suddenly lose resolution, lose bandwidth, then should you also lose your resolution, right? And how much of a resolution loss can be done before the viewer starts seeing perceptible changes in the quality, right? If someone who is watching a video suddenly sees a decrease in bandwidth, what portions of the video can you compress more aggressively, right? So for instance, if you are watching a video and this is a picture that has been broadcast, so this part of the image, even if you lose details in this part of the image, it is all right, but you cannot lose details in this part of the image, because if you lose details in this part, or if you compress this part very aggressively, then human beings can no longer perceive what is the content in this region, but in this region it is okay. Another set of applications are ones where the input is an image and the output is text. One example is license plate recognition, which is very popular. Surveillance agencies, law enforcement agencies, it's very popular among those, and it's being widely used across the world. More or less standardized algorithms are available for this particular problem. Handwriting recognition and optical character recognition is also very popular. Handwriting recognition is the recognition of human written data. So if you are writing a piece of text on a paper, you might either want to scan that document in and then that is recognized, or you are writing with a stylus on a tablet. So both of these fall under the broad domain of handwriting recognition. The former, where you are writing on a piece of paper and then you take a picture of it or you scan it in, that's called offline handwriting recognition. Then you have online handwriting recognition, where you are writing with a stylus. So if you are writing with a stylus on a tablet, that's called online handwriting recognition. There are some arguments that online handwriting recognition is not really image processing, because you don't have an image but you have a data that is coming from a stylus. But broadly the techniques overlap with each other for online handwriting recognition and offline handwriting recognition. You also have optical character recognition. Optical character recognition is when you are trying to recognize machine printed text. That would be optical character recognition. And both handwriting recognition and optical character recognition has been implemented for many languages. You have HWR and OCRs available for Chinese, Japanese, English obviously, Hindi, and a whole bunch of languages across the globe. You also have a set of problems which are the biometrics problems. These are very popular in the sense that face recognition, iris recognition, fingerprint scanning. Again, a very hot topic among law enforcement agencies and large government agencies. A few unique challenges exist in the HWR and biometrics problem. One of the challenges in handwriting recognition is how do you adapt to different users, and this challenge exists even in biometrics. For instance, let's say I want to implement a handwriting recognition engine and I'm designing it for tablets. So I want to ship a tablet where on a smartphone or on a iPad or a tablet, if individuals write something, their handwriting should be recognized. The challenge is I may not be able to get samples of handwriting for every user, right? So I may be able to get samples of users, let's say in North America. I may be able to get samples of users from Canada, but I cannot still get samples of every potential buyer or every potential customer in North America. So if a new customer buys my tablet, I should be able to recognize that customer's handwriting with very little training data. So that's a big problem in handwriting recognition, and the same problem exists in biometrics. Let's say I want to do face recognition. How many samples of a user's face will I require before I can do very reliable face recognition? So every one of you must have used iPhone's face unlock, right? And face unlock is present in many applications. You have operating systems that come with the capacity to do face unlock. You have smartphones which have the capacity where you can just take a picture and based on your picture it unlocks your face. You have cell phones with fingerprint scanners. You can put your fingerprint on the cell phone and it unlocks the phone for you. It recognizes your fingerprint and unlocks the phone. Now in that kind of a scenario, how many samples of the fingerprint should I need before I can reliably recognize the user? Or how many samples of the face should I need before I can reliably recognize the user? And remember, it's not a simple problem. There could be various kinds of lighting conditions in which the user is using the phone. So maybe I'm using the phone, and for example, when I got the phone at home and I unboxed the phone and I opened the phone for the first time, and when I start using it, when I set up the face-based unlock system, my room is very well lit, it is daytime, and I'm using it at that time. So all the input images that I supplied to the phone were during the day. But let's say someday when I'm trying to unlock the phone, I'm using it at evening. The lighting is less. Would the face recognition algorithm still work? Ditto goes for fingerprint recognition. When I'm using the phone, maybe my fingerprint had a certain orientation. But when I recorded my fingerprint, when I first opened the smartphone and I recorded the fingerprint had a different orientation. My finger had a different orientation. So how do I account for all of these changes? So these are some unique challenges in both biometrics and handwriting recognition. And in both of the applications, in many of these applications, when you start looking at, for example, license plate recognition or handwriting recognition, optical character recognition or biometrics, the requirements on accuracy are very high. So for instance, when a user is trying to use the phone to make a call, if the smartphone makes a mistake, it's not able to recognize the face of the user and it is not able to unlock the phone, that's a problem. But that problem can be easily solved. The user can, for example, take a second picture, or the user can use a password to unlock the phone. But instead of that, let's say you have face recognition implemented at an airport, and this face recognition system is trying to match the faces of passengers with potential terrorists or potential offenders. If that system makes a mistake, it's not able to recognize a passenger as who he is, right? Or it misrecognizes the passenger as a terrorist, or it misses an offender and it is not able to recognize an offender, that's very bad. Even if one terrorist manages to escape through the system, that's bad. Similarly, if a lot of people get recognized as terrorists, a lot of ordinary law-abiding people get recognized as terrorists, that's also a problem. You cannot have those kinds of situations in biometrics. So the false positive rate and the true positive rate has to be very tightly controlled. Let's look at a few examples to see why it is a little bit difficult to get very high accuracy in these applications. So for instance, you can see these are different samples of the alphabet 5 written by different individuals. So you can see that the styles are completely different. And these are the alphabet 5 and the alphabet A printed using different fonts. So irrespective of these changes in the handwriting or these changes in the font, the output should be very same. Right? All of these should map to the digit 5, right? All these examples, and all these examples should map to the alphabet A. Similarly, these are faces of the same person taken from different angles. And you also have faces of an individual taken with different kinds of makeup, different dressing styles. So when you start seeing these kinds of challenges happening, right? Same person at different age, or same person with different dress and different styles, right? You start making the problem more and more challenging, right? Image processing applications or face recognition applications typically rely on certain features of the image to recognize faces, for example, or to recognize digits or alphabets. When these features change, you have to ensure that the output of the algorithm doesn't change, and this becomes a little tricky. In the subsequent lectures, we will learn how to do this, right? And we will also learn what are the kind of challenges we face in order to do this. Now let's look at some applications where the input is an image plus some human interaction and the output is 3D graphics. Sometimes the output could also be text. So this is a problem in medical diagnosis. So for instance, if a doctor receives a bunch of medical images, if any one of you has taken a CT image or an MR image, the computer tomography image or the magnetic resonance images are available in, for every patient you get multiple images. You get a deck of images, right? So in a CT image, the scan would contain multiple images for each patient. So when you have multiple images, the doctor might use certain interactions to pass through these images and look at different views of the image. So this is a 3D view of a heart, right? The CT image of a heart has been segmented, all the blood vessels have been segmented and the structure is clearly visible. The surgeon might use some interactions with the mouse or with the keyboard or with other devices to rotate this image around to view the image from different angles, right? And the output would be 3D graphics. So the input was a bunch of CT images or several CT images or MR images plus the view from which the doctor likes to look at the image or the internal organs, and the output is the 3D view or the detailed view of the internal organs of the patient. And this is very, very important in applications such as virtual surgery, very important in applications such as simulated driving or flight simulators, for example. For a good understanding of how image plus touch can be useful in 3D graphics applications, you can look at these two YouTube videos. One is on urban combat training using virtual reality, and the second one is on using virtual reality, haptics and image processing to do simulation of suturing. Right? How do you train doctors on doing suturing using 3D graphics and haptics? Very interesting applications, right from gaming, 3D immersive gaming, to training on flight simulators, to doing virtual reality training of army units, to training doctors, uses these kinds of technologies, right? Image plus touch plus 3D graphics. While we have used this division of applications into these three groups, input being image, output being image, input being image, output being text, and input is image plus text, and the output is 3D graphics. This division is not sacrosanct. This is something that I have used to make it easier for you to understand. This is something that I personally use in my lectures, but it's not necessary that this is a sacrosanct division. So you can actually consider image processing applications to be an overlap of some of these areas. So for instance, if you are trying to do license plate recognition, right, it is very much possible that people might want to do image enhancement before they do license plate recognition. So for instance, if you have a car that is coming towards a toll booth or coming towards a security gate, and this vehicle is coming at night, so at night the lighting is less, so you may have to do image enhancement before you actually do the recognition. So it is possible that some of these areas are merged with each other. There could be a significant overlap between these application domains. Now we shall discuss image acquisition. How does a human eye actually see, or for that matter, how does the eye of any animal see? The eye is made up of these basic structures. You have the cornea, which is the outermost layer of the eye. It is responsible for ensuring that the light that enters the eye gets refracted and it passes through this called the iris and the pupil. So the iris is the structure that gives color to the eye, the central structure, which is either black, blue, or different colors for different people, right? So that's the iris. And you might also be familiar with iris recognition, which is a very popular biometric that is used in very widely. Now the iris at the center has a pupil. The pupil is the black colored circle at the very center of the iris, and this pupil either becomes large or it becomes small, and either increases or decreases the amount of light that passes through the eye. So the iris and the pupil are responsible for either increasing or decreasing the amount of light that gets into your eye. After that you have the lens. The lens is a biconvex structure. It ensures that the light that passes through the eye, it actually focuses at a particular location within the retina. And the retina is the innermost structure of the eye, and this is the place where the light actually falls, and the light gets corrected here, and there are photoreceptors on the retina, and these photoreceptors are sensitive to light. They are sensitive to photons, right? And these are responsible for actually converting the photons or the light that falls on the retina into signals that are carried to the brain, or electrical impulses that are carried to the brain. So what you have here is the light enters, and this is the thin layer of the retina. It's about half a millimeter in thickness, and as light enters and falls on the retina, as light enters through the cornea, then the pupil, then the lens, and falls on the retina, what happens is it excites rods and cones. Now the retina has several layers. The rods and the cones are the nerves that finally react to the light, and they take signals to the brain. Right, and we'll see what the rods and cones are in a minute. So rods and cones are the basic structures within the retina which are sensitive to light, and which help us convert the light that is incident on the retina into an electrical impulse that is carried to the brain through our nerves. Rods are sensitive to small quantities of light, and cones respond relatively to more intense light. So rods are also less directional as compared to cones. That is, in comparison to rods, if light is incident on cones directly, so if you have a cone and light gets incident directly on it, let's look at this image. So you have a cone here. If light falls directly in from the front, like light falls directly on the cone like this, then the cone generates a certain amount of electricity, or generates a certain electrical impulse and passes it through the nerves. But if the light comes at an angle, so light comes from here and falls on the cones, the amount of electrical impulse or signal that is generated from the cones is much smaller. Right? This difference in the case of rods is lesser. Whether light comes straight through the rod, straight through onto the rod, or light comes at an angle to the rod, the difference of excitation in the rod is very small. But that difference is much larger in the case of cones. Cones get excited if light falls directly on them, but they don't get excited if light falls at an angle. Rods also, there is a difference in the intensity of the electrical impulse, but that difference is very small. Rods are monochromatic. They do not differentiate between different wavelengths or colors of light that fall on the rod. But cones are sensitive to different wavelengths. So for instance, if red color light falls on certain cones, these cones will get more excited. If green color light falls on certain cones, they get more excited. So cones are of three prominent types. So we call them the L cones, or the long wavelength cones. These are sensitive to red light. The M cones are the medium wavelength cones. These are sensitive to green color light. And the short wavelength cones, which are sensitive to blue light. And the distribution of the cones and rods in the eye is also not uniform. So if you see here, this is an image of the retinal wall, right? And let's say the light is incident like this, and this is the fovea, right? And this is the blind spot. This is the blind spot where all the nerves from the eye actually enter the brain. So this is the optic nerve, and from here all the nerve endings pass through the retina and enter the brain. Right. If you notice the distribution of rods and cones through this retinal wall, you will see that cones are very dense at the center. So cones are very dense at the fovea. So this this diagram here, the graph below, it depicts the distribution of cones with respect to the retinal wall. Right. So right at the fovea, you have a very large number of cones. But as you go away from the fovea, the number of cones falls down dramatically. Right, you can see this curve, it's falling down dramatically. The number of rods at about 15 to 20 degrees away from the fovea is very high. And then again, rods also fall off, but not as much as cones. Right, so rods are also more evenly distributed around here and here, more concentrated around here and here, and they fall off as you go away from the fovea, but compared to the cones, they are more evenly distributed. These references would help you understand a little bit more about the sensitivity of retinal rods as compared to cones, and they give you much more elaborate understanding of how they are distributed across the eye. This diagram here again shows the distribution of L, M and S cones in a normal person. So for instance, this is the distribution of cones in a normal person. So you can see that you have a large number of L cones which are sensitive to long wavelength or red color light. You have a few M cones, right, the blue, the green ones, the green dots, and you also have a lot of S cones, right, are the ones that are sensitive to blue light. And on the right, what you have are the cones for a colorblind person. So the colorblind person has very few L cones in this particular sample, and it can be different distributions as the quality of the vision is different. And there are about 90 million rods and about 4 to 10 million cones in a normal eye. So the rods outnumber the cones by a very large margin. So you have way more rods than you have cones. This diagram here is showing different rods and cones for different animals. So these are the rods and cones of a frog, these are the rods and cones of a fish, a turtle and a human being. So you can see here that the foveal cone is much more thinner, much more focused, whereas the human rod and the human cone are like this. And this is the foveal cone, right? That is the cone at the human fovea, the cones that are present here. But you have to remember one thing, human eyes are sensitive to a very narrow spectrum of light. So light has actually much larger wavelength, or rather photons have a much larger wavelength and a much higher range than what is visible to the human eye. You have gamma rays, you have X-rays, you have ultraviolet rays, and then you have the visible spectrum of light, right, which ranges from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. This is what the human eye can see. But you also have infrared light, you have microwave, you have FM, AM and so on, right? So the entire electromagnetic spectrum is not seen by the human eye, but these are all photons, right? And what you need to understand is, when you see light, you're seeing light because light of a specific color is what is reflected by an object. All the other light ends up getting absorbed by the object. So for instance, bananas reflect yellow color light better than all the other wavelengths. So what bananas do is they absorb all other wavelengths and reflect only yellow color light. Hence we see them in yellow color, right? In fact, these kinds of principles of various objects or various food items reflecting different colors of light has been used to determine whether the product or the food product has perfectly ripened or not ripened. You can go through a paper by Lee et al. In 1997 which used LED lights and phototransistors to determine whether bananas were ripe or not. And here you have the response of different types of cones. So the L, M and S cones are again not uniformly sensitive to all wavelengths. So there are a larger number of L cones which are sensitive to this wavelength, and lesser number which are sensitive to this wavelength, and so on and so forth. So great, human beings have rods and cones, and so do animals. But what about digital images? How do we acquire images so that a computer can interpret the image? So when we say digital images, you are referring to images that can be loaded onto a computer, which you can process on a PC or a cell phone or a smartphone or what have you, right? The basic building block of computer vision or digital images is a charge coupled device, such as a camera or a scanner. Most cameras and scanners contain some form of photovoltaic cells which are sensitive to light. So for instance, this is a charge coupled device from a 2.1 megapixel HP camera, and this has a small photosensitive layer at the center which is sensitive to different kinds of light. Right, so you have photovoltaic cells which are arranged in a matrix, and these are made of semiconductors that are sensitive to light. So when light falls on these semiconductors, a small amount of voltage is generated. This voltage is then corrected and passed back to other circuitry, which actually amplifies this voltage and allows a computer to record the signal. On top of the photovoltaic cell, you have a color mosaic. Now what the color mosaic does is, it allows only one wavelength of light to pass through. So for example, this green color mosaic, so the green colored dots or grids here, they will allow only green color to pass through. The red colored pixels here, they will allow only red color to pass through, and so on. Like the blue colored mosaics will only allow blue color to pass through. Now because only blue, green or red color passes through this particular mosaic, each photovoltaic cell therefore reacts to the respective color. So for instance, the cell that is right under this particular block, right, this pixel, this photovoltaic cell right under this, it will receive light only from green color. So if your CCD camera is looking at a scene in which there is no green color at all, this particular cell or this particular part of the mosaic will not let any light pass through, and therefore the photovoltaic cell that is right under it will not register any voltage at all, right? So the way the CCD camera or the way cameras work is, you have a photovoltaic cell which is sensitive to light. On top of that you place a filter which allows only certain wavelengths to pass through, and these filters are called Bayer filters. And there are many kinds of filters. There are different ratios of red, green and blue that are used, but broadly these are the three colors that are present, and these are the three colors that are registered by a charge coupled device. Very early versions of digital cameras obviously recorded only black and white or grayscale, but later versions were implemented with a Bayer filter, or a filter that could segment different lights, that could block different wavelengths of light. So we have seen that you have charge coupled devices which are able to capture or convert the light into electricity or voltage that can be recorded into a digital image. Now the way light enters the camera and actually gets incident on this charge coupled device is very similar to the mechanics of the eye. So you have a lens in the front. So this is a cutaway section of a camera, of a SLR camera. In this particular camera, instead of having a charge coupled device, you have a film here. This is an older camera, but in modern cameras you would have a charge coupled device, which is a digital device of this nature, and that would actually convert the light. But how does the light actually pass through? So you have a light that enters through a lens assembly. This is your lens assembly, and then you have an aperture. So there is an aperture here which actually increases or decreases the amount of light that gets in. So just like the pupil of the eye, the aperture in a camera controls the amount of light that gets in. In SLR cameras you also have a mirror assembly. So there is a mirror that actually reflects the light onto a prism, and because of the prism you are able to see what you are taking a picture of. So the charge coupled device or the film is located here, but the way you see the scene that you are taking a picture of is through this prism and this mirror assembly. So the light is coming in through the lenses and the aperture, getting reflected off the mirror, going to the prism, and you are able to see the scene through the eyepiece. When you click the camera, this mirror goes away, this mirror gets removed, it goes up, and there is a shutter that opens up in front of the film or the charge coupled device, and when the shutter opens, light falls on the charge coupled device. The charge coupled device, which you saw on the earlier slide, generates an electrical impulse which then gets recorded onto your SD card. For more details on how cameras and flatbed scanners work, you might want to look at these videos. These are very useful to understand the basics. Now we have seen how human eyes work. We have also seen how cameras acquire images. Now let's see what happens after a charge coupled device acquires the light, converts that into voltage and stores it somewhere. what is the storage mechanism, what is stored inside those files, right? There are many different file formats. We are not going to go into JPEG file formats or PNG file formats or TIFF file formats. That's a level of abstraction which we are not going to study. But what we are interested in is what is stored within these files, what is the data structure in which content is stored. Typically, a color image is made up of 3 channels or 3 colors, which are red, green and blue. And let's say you had a scanner which scanned in an image, and let's say the image was made of this colored band. So there is a colored band which goes from violet color to white color, and there are some characters printed on it. So there is a word color hyphen gray hyphen black and white printed on it, and this piece of paper is what you scanned in. Now what would the scanner give you as output? The scanner would give you as output a matrix that in turn contains 3 matrices, and this matrix may be stored using different data structures. Again, a TIFF image would store it in a specific data structure, JPEG would use a specific data structure, and so on. We are not going to go into those details in this lecture, but what ends up happening essentially is you have this data, right? You have a matrix that is containing values between 0 to 255. So for instance, the topmost pixel here, like I have taken this small area of the image, I have taken out the raw values from the red, green and blue colors, or the red, green and blue channels. We often refer to them as either colors or channels. Right? We have acquired the red, green and blue channels, and we are examining the individual values. So the first pixel here, the top left hand corner pixel, would contain the value 117 in the red channel, 53 for the green and 210 for blue. And that's what actually, when you combine these, you actually get purple. So again, you can understand this better if you take a white colored wall and you lay out 3 beams of light. You overlap 3 beams of light of different color on it. So there is green colored light, there is blue colored light and there is red colored light. As different intensities of the red, green and blue colored light combine, you get different colors. So for instance, when red and green color are combined, you get yellow. When red and blue is combined, you get shades of purple. And when you have more of red and blue, you get violet color. And when all 3 colors mix up, you get white. Right? So you can see that here also. So you have red and green, which we have combined in different ways. So if red is 255 and green is 0, and a blue we have kept it as 0 in this particular band, in this color band. So if red is 255, green is 0 and blue obviously is 0, blue is not here, then the color would show up as red, like this would be the color. If the red component, right, or the red channel is 255 and the green channel value is 127, this is how the color would show. It's an orange color. If red and green are equal to each other, 255 and 255, then it comes up as yellow. And then if red is 127, green is 255, it comes up as this light green color. And if green is 255 and red is 0, you get this color. Right? So these are sample combinations of red and green, and similarly you can have combinations of red, green and blue. You can have combinations of red and blue, green and blue, and so on. Now let's take a few RGB values again from this image and see how you have colors coming out by the combination of RG and B. So this is the red channel, green channel and blue channel. Now let's say I took students from this classroom, all the students from this class, and I showed you these 3 patches, right? I enlarged these patches and I showed them to you, and I asked you if these patches are the same. Most of you, a significant majority of you would say these are the same. But if you actually look at their RGB values, the red, green and blue channel values, the values are all different. The red, green, blue, all the values are different. So is this color really same or is this color different? So what you need to remember is human perception may perceive a color to be the same, but in the RGB space or in the integer value space or in the numerical space, the colors could be different. This is one of the challenges in image processing. What the human eye perceives to be the same may not be the same for a CCD camera. Remember, the CCD camera is converting the image into electrical impulses, and then these electrical impulses are being converted into numbers. Typically the integers are between 0 to 255 for each channel. So red goes from 0 to 255, green goes from 0 to 255, blue from 0 to 255. The reason why this is 0 to 255 is these are 256 different colors. The number of bits used to store values at every cell, so for every cell the number of bits that are used to store the electrical impulse are 8 bits. So the electrical value that comes in from this particular cell, from each cell, is divided into, is stored in a data which contains 8 bits. Now 8 bits can store maximum 256 values, and therefore you have traditionally values going from 0 to 255 for each of these channels. And the challenge in image processing, one of the challenges in image processing is the fidelity or the accuracy to which the light that is incident on the CCD is very high. The fidelity to which the CCD can separate the light is high, and the perception of the eye is lesser than that, is slightly lesser than that. However, there is also a problem in terms of how red, green and blue combine to give you a single perception. Now let's look at what we mean by that, right? So let's say this is your reference color. This is a color that I've selected using a popular image processing package. So this color is 250, 250, 33. So the red is 250, green is 250 and blue is 33, and this is yellow, right? So if you notice, 255 and 255, red and green are high values and blue is 0, you get yellow color. So that's what you have here. This is a shade of yellow, right? This yellow and the yellow that we saw previously, if you observe closely, is not the same. So this is a certain shade of yellow. Now let's say you got some other image patches of slightly different colors. So let's say you got these 3 image patches. Now the RGB colors of these 3 patches are like this: 210, 210, 30, 230, 240, 90 and 210, 210, 80. These are 3 different patches. Now let's say I want to figure out what is the comparison between the reference color, so this image patch and this image patch, this color patch. How would you do it? Let us again say, obviously human beings can look at this and figure out, hey, color number 1 and color number 3, they are very different from this color. So these 2 colors are very different from this color, and probably this one is very close, right? So the reference color number 2 is the reference color is very similar to color number 2, right? But how do you do it? Using digital imaging, right? So how does a computer figure out this difference? Now what you have in images is you have the RGB values. So what you have in an image is you get the red, green and blue values from different pixels, right? So you get these channels, the red channel, green channel and blue channel. So a computer is not a human being. It cannot combine colors by mixing them like this and sort of perceive the way a human being perceives colors. All that a computer can understand is integer values coming from this, the red channel matrix, the green channel matrix and the blue matrix. Now what are the RGB colors in the reference? The RGB color in the reference, or the RGB value in the reference, is 250, 250 and 33. What is the red, green and blue value for color number 1? It is 210, 210, 30. And how do you compare the distance? So let us say we are doing Euclidean distance. Euclidean distance would be 210 minus 250 the whole squared, plus 210 minus 250 the whole squared, plus 30 minus 33 the whole squared, and then you do a square root of the whole thing. If you did that between the reference color and color patch number 1, so the color number 1, the distance that you get is 56.65. If you computed Euclidean distance between color number 2 and the reference color, the answer is 61.23, and the distance between color number 3 and the reference color is 73.55. Now you can see that the reference color is actually far away from color number 1 and color number 2. So you can see that this is 56.65 and 73.55. So this is the closest one, right? So the color number 1 is very close to reference number 1 as compared to these 2 colors. But if you asked a human being which of these three colors is similar to this, a human would say, hey, this color is very similar to this color. But if you look at the Euclidean distance, 61.23 is greater than 56.65. So this is actually far away from this. So what you need to understand is, even though in digital cameras or scanners or many digital devices, RGB is the channel in which color is captured. So RGB is the modality in which color is captured. It is not a good distance measure. If you try to measure distances between pixels in terms of red, green and blue, the perception differences will not be the same. So a human being might perceive certain colors to be the same, but in RGB space the colors may be different, right? So in RGB space, if you compute a distance, these two colors are similar to each other, but according to human beings, these two colors are similar to each other. And this again becomes an important problem in image processing. So for example, if I told you to compare different qualities of oranges, right, you are looking for a certain shade of a certain color. Or if I asked you to compare mangoes, mangoes are green in color, but mangoes can have different shades of green. If I told you that a specific shade of green is what I am interested in, you have to ensure that you are not using RGB to do the distance measure, because even though the different shades of green are the same, in the RGB space they might be different. So what kind of color measures would you end up using? You use other color measures, which are CMYK color measures, CIE color measures, CIE LAB color measures. So the LAB color measures are the most popular ones, because Euclidean distance and CIE LAB map to human perception differences. So if two colors are very close to each other in the LAB space or the CIE LAB space, for a human being also the two colors will be very similar to each other. This is not the situation in RGB. In RGB, two colors may be close to each other, but a human being may think that these two colors are different. There are other ways of digital image acquisition which we haven't covered in this lecture. We might cover some of those when we discuss medical image analytics. There is magnetic resonance imaging, there is X-ray imaging, there is spectroscopy, and there is LIDAR. There are also other wavelengths of light, and these wavelengths can be captured using some of these imaging techniques. Now that we have covered an introduction to image processing applications and image acquisition, we are now going to get into image representation. How are images stored? What kind of data structures are available for image storage? So some of the popular image representation techniques are black and white images. These are images where there are only two colors or only two levels of storage. When we were discussing charge coupled devices, we mentioned that you can have three channels, right? Red, green and blue, and each cell, each photovoltaic cell would be stored using 8 bits. The electrical impulse coming from each photovoltaic cell will be stored in 8 bits. And because it's stored in 8 bits, you have values going from 0 to 255. You have 256 values. Now, in the early version of cameras that had come out, you only had two levels. You had either black or white. So the value was either 0 or 1. Now this is also a part of image representation. So there are black and white images, also known as binary images, where the data is stored only in zeros and ones. So the data can be 0 or 1, and in some cases, in subsequent lectures you will be using OpenCV to read images. So the 0 and 1 is sometimes read as 0 and 255. 255 would represent white color and 0 would represent the black color. So for instance, if this were the image that we were scanning in, that a small piece of image which is printed in only black and white color, this particular part of the image would look completely white. All the values will be either 255 or they will be 1. Now this part of the image, if you can notice, this very tiny part has some regions which are white, and there is this upper part of the W. This upper part of the W, the top left hand corner of the W, has zeros in it. Right, so this part is completely white, therefore it is all 255s, and this part, most of it is white, so most of it is 255, but there is a small portion of the W which is jutting into this image, and that's zeros. Right. In a different version of the same, the 255 might actually be replaced by ones and the zeros would remain as it is. So this would be a black and white image where the white is represented by ones and the blacks are zeros, and this is an image where the white is represented by 255 and the black is represented by zeros. You also have grayscale images. Grayscale images are where there is a single channel. So you don't have R, G and B. You don't have red, green and blue, but you have a single channel which is just the intensity of the image. So for instance, if you take this region, right, so this is the same image which we saw earlier, a couple of slides earlier, this image patch, but instead of being printed on a printer using violet color, we have just used gray color to print it, and then we have scanned it in. And when we scanned it in, we scanned it by ignoring all the channels. We scanned it using only a single channel. So there is no Bayer filter. So there is no Bayer filter, or we ignored the values of the Bayer filter. So we ignored the aspect that the Bayer filter is filtering out certain colors, and we converted all the photovoltaic cells into a single channel, which was from 0 to 255. So that's this image. So if you take the upper portion here and you take the integer values, they are all 78s. Right? So this is a single color of gray. 255 would be completely white, 0 would be completely black. This is sort of in between. This is towards the 0, right? So this is dark gray. Now when you come to this region, let's take this small part. Right? This has a mix of white and gray. So if you notice, this portion is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 87 and 34. So that's this W here, the top left corner of the W. And if you come to this region and you zoom into this and see what are the pixel values, you will see them to be all 255s. And subsequently, when we actually write programming assignments, we will see how to interpret these matrices, how to read these matrices, how to look at these values. So this is the integer format. This is if the image is stored in integer format. It is also possible to store the image in real values or floating point values. When you do that, these values will range from 0 to 1. So the gray colored value will be close to 0. So you can see here the value here is a uniform 0.3059. So the value from here is 0.3059. If you take an image from this area, this part, and you zoom it in and you observe its real value, it is all ones. If you take an image from this region, most of it is very close to 1. It's all 0.9137, 0.9098 and so on, very close to 1, but some of the values are close to 0. So for example, here you can see 0.0039, 0.0039, 0.0039, and you can also see here 0.1333, right? This is the region from this part. So the top left hand corner of the W is what you see here. Right? So the reason why again this came up is because you were storing, typically charge coupled devices or the photovoltaic cells were storing their values, the electrical impulses, in 8 bits. And 8 bits can store 256 values, and therefore people stuck to 0 to 255. Now think about what would happen if you had only 4 bits of storage. How many values would you be able to store? In a color image, we have already seen color images. You have multiple channels, and these multiple channels contain the red, green and blue colors, and the values would be somewhat like this. So you can see here the topmost pixel is red color is 117, green color is 53, blue color is 210. We already saw this. We already saw this here. The same thing gets repeated at other parts of the image. You get 3 different channels, and these values will be between 0 to 255. You can also have real valued numbers between 0 to 1. In most of the assignments for this particular class, we will be focusing on integer values, whether it be RGB images or grayscale images. We will look at integer values between 0 to 255. There are some rare cases where we may look at real valued numbers between 0 to 1. there are other forms of image representation which relies on the fact that human perception does not require all combinations of RGB values. So let's understand how these are stored, right? So for example, let's take again this patch which contains different colors, and then you have this part of the image, right? Here you can see there are different colors, right? You have 117, 11, so red is 117, 53, 210 here. But a different portion of this small patch has a very different color combination. It is 115 with this part. The upper right hand corner of this small rectangle, of this tiny rectangle, is this pixel. 115 is the red value, 54 is the green value, and 210 is the blue value. But if you showed a human being these two colors, you showed a human being 117, 53 and 210, and 115, 54 and 210, they would not be able to make out the difference. They would say, hey, these two colors are the same. So what started happening in some popular image storage applications, so if you have Photoshop or you have JPEG images which you are storing and transmitting, what they started doing is, they said if colors are not different by human perception, we are going to combine these colors, and they created what are called as indexed images. And let's look at what these indexed images are. So what these indexed images will do is, they will look at these colors and they would say, hey, these colors 117, 53, 210, 114, 56, 203, 112, 58, 198, they all, from the perspective of a human being, look very similar to each other. We will replace these colors by a single color and we will have an index to that color, and let's see how that is done. So you have this image, right? You have this small region. Instead of storing the individual RGB value, you will store an index, which is in this case 65, index number 65. And what is this index? This index refers to an RGB value. So there is a lookup table here which contains all the colors in this image, right? And this particular region corresponds to color number 65, and this color number 65 is red equal to 87, green equal to 50, B equal to 148, and this is the color, right? So the image would be made of two parts. One is a matrix which stores the index values. It's just storing the index values, and a lookup table which says what are the different RGB values for that index. Now please understand, the number of different colors, the number of RGB combinations can be more than 256, right? Individual R value, the individual R value can go from 0 to 255. The green value is also going from 0 to 255, but the blue value is also from 0 to 255. But their combinations can be much more than that. But in an image, if you take all possible combinations, this index would have a size of 255 into 255 into 255. Right? So that's a large number of colors. But if you took this image, and you tried to find out how many colors can be perceived by a human being, the total number of possible colors are 255 to the power of 3, right? But in this particular image, how many colors can be perceived by human beings? That might be a very limited set of colors. So maybe there could be just 300 colors, or in this case 256 colors, right? Or there could be like 400 colors which can be perceived by a human being. So what you do is, you collect those colors which can be perceived by a human being from this image, convert these colors into a matrix where the RGB values are stored, and there is an integer index that maps to this RGB value, right? So this is like a dictionary lookup, where entry number 2 in the dictionary corresponds to the color 4, 2 and 8, right? So when you are referring to entry number 2, for example, here there is an entry number 2 which is the upper part of the W here, that would correspond to the RGB value 4, 2 and 8. So these are indexed images. So what indexed images do is, if you were to store these RGB values separately, the red, green and blue channels separately, so for an image, which is having, let's say, 2 megapixels. So the CCD array that we saw earlier, for example, this HP camera is rated at 2.8 megapixels. That means the charge coupled device or the CCD array has approximately 2 million pixels or 2 million photovoltaic cells, and each photovoltaic cell is in turn generating 8 bits, right? The data that is getting stored from the photovoltaic cell is generating 8 bits. Now with a Bayer filter and with different colors getting separated out, there is a way by which these photovoltaic cells are capturing only one color. But what happens in this camera is the RGB value. So here you are getting the G value, right? But it also has neighboring blue and red pixels. The blue and red pixel value of this central photovoltaic cell of this cell gets interpolated or extrapolated from these blue and red values. So each photovoltaic cell along with its own color also extrapolates and generates green, the blue and the red value. So a green photovoltaic cell would have its own 8-bit value, but it also takes the neighboring 8-bit values and generates the blue and the red color. So this entire photovoltaic cell, which has 2 million pixels, would therefore generate 3 arrays, each array containing 2 million values. So what you would end up having is, from this camera you will get 3 channels, red, green and blue. Each channel would contain 2 million values. So that's a lot of memory, right? Obviously now the storage costs have come down, so the memory cost is less, but if you have to process the data repeatedly, you have to store it on multiple devices, the cost of storage will eventually grow. The cost of networking will also grow when you want to transmit this image. So what was suggested is, instead of storing the red, green and blue channels separately, as it is, you have colors which are not different with respect to human perception. So here the RGB values are different, but the color is not different, right? Human beings cannot perceive the difference between these colors. So why store these values separately? What was done is, given an input image, you would try to determine what are an optimal number of colors in this image which can be separated or differentiated by a human being. For example, in this image the colors would be these, right? So you might have 256 different colors which are coming from this image, or you may have 400 colors or 500 colors. Now instead of storing the RGB channels separately, what you do is you store only one value for every pixel. So here in the RGB representation of the image, you are storing red, green and blue separately for every pixel. What you do in indexed images is, the first pixel, or rather all the pixels in this region, each pixel in the image is storing only one value, and that value is an index into a dictionary, and this dictionary tells you what is the RGB value. So for instance, the pixel here corresponds to the index 65, and 65 is 8750148. The pixel here, right, the top portion of the W corresponds to index number 2, and this is RGB value of 4, 2 and 8. The index of this pixel is 1, and that is 0, 1, 0, and so on and so forth. So there is an index 47 here, and that's 45, 36 and 65, which is black in color, but it's not as black as this, and so on and so forth across the length of the image, across the entire image, right? So indexed images would typically reduce the storage requirement or the memory requirement of an image by 1/3. So instead of storing 3 channels, red, green and blue, you are only storing one channel, right, or an index into this particular array or this particular dictionary. You also have another representation called chain code representation. Chain code representations are something that we will touch upon again in the subsequent slides, but this is a representation which is suitable only for black and white images. So let's imagine you had a black and white image which is like this. So ignore the blue colored border, but just consider the image inside it. So there is B and I, right, and these white areas are completely white, so they are the color 255, or rather the value is 255, and everything else, the black is 0, right? So the chain code representation represents only the borders of the black and white color. So for example, the way this image would be stored is, you would take all the pixels in this outer border of B, right? The boundary between the black and the white pixels, and you would store their XY coordinates. So for example, in this case you have 63 coordinates and their XY values are like this: 8, 9, 8, 10, 8, 11 and so on. So this is what you would store, right? Similarly, you will store the values for the inner loop, inner boundary, 47 coordinates, 23 coordinates and so on and so forth. So the total number of values that you have to store for this image are 63 plus 47 plus 23 plus 33, right? Only 32 values. So the chain code would contain 332 integers, right? Whereas the image, if you stored by itself, right, as a black and white image or even a grayscale image, would contain 1295 pixels. So this is a 37 pixel, right, has a size of 37 by 35, right? So the total number of pixels in this image is 1295. But if you just store the boundary values, it would be 332 integers. Now there is a difference between what we call as 4 connected and 8 connected images. So there are chain codes with different connectivities, and these are described in page 483 and 482 of our text. There is also another representation called run length encoding representation. This is the number of white and black pixels along each row of the image. So for instance, if you took this image and computed the run length encoding, the values would be 35B. 35B means 35 black, right? So there are 35 pixels, 35 contiguous pixels which are black in color. Similarly, the next row has 35 black pixels. Similarly, the next row has 35 black pixels and so on and so forth, till you come here where you have 27 black pixels, 3 white pixels, 5 black pixels and so on and so forth, right? So when you come here, you reach this eye, right? So the eye has a width of 3 white pixels. So you have 27 black pixels, then 3 white pixels and then again 5 black pixels. So that's your run length encoding. So a quick review of image representation. We saw that we have the matrix representation. It is a simple representation where matrices could contain integer values or real valued numbers. You stored color images in the form of different channels, red, green and blue. You stored grayscale values in terms of only one channel, which ranged from either 0 to 255 or 0 to 1. And you also had black and white images. We also saw indexed representation, where a dictionary is stored to reduce the data required to store the image or transmit the image. We also saw chain code implementations and run length implementations. Now let's look at a few challenges in image processing. We are only going to look at a subset of the challenges. We will not look at all the challenges. In the subsequent lectures, we will be looking at even more difficulties in image processing and how these are solved using computer vision algorithms. Some of these challenges are acquisition related challenges. These are problems that occur because of an issue with the devices that are used to acquire images. So for instance, you have out of focus images, right, or lens flare. We had studied a couple of slides earlier that you have lens assemblies in a camera, or you have CCD arrays in a scanner. Now in a camera, you may not be able to focus all regions of the image uniformly, or all regions of the scene uniformly. So objects that are far away from the camera might be out of focus if you are using a certain lens. If you are using a lens that is able to focus at regions which are far away from the camera, then that lens will not be able to see images that are closer. So you can see this here. So this particular lens is able to focus on images that are in this area, in the center area. Parts of the image that are very close to the lens and part of the image that is very far away from the lens is not clear. right? So there could be out of focus issues in a camera because of limited range of the lens. Now certain lenses can also exhibit lens flare. So lens flare is when there is very bright light in one corner of the scene. So when you are taking an image, if certain parts of the objects in front of you are brightly lit, certain parts are dimly lit, then you can experience lens flare. You can also see this in the form of reflection and glossy surfaces. So for instance, this is a very glossy object which is reflecting the light, so you cannot read some of the alphabets. Now this is something that we call a matte surface. So this doesn't have this reflective behavior, but the color reflection itself is dull. So the matte surfaces absorb too much light, they don't reflect a lot of the light. So you again have issues in reading these kinds of documents. Now exposure and lighting issues are also there. This is the same scene taken with two different kinds of lighting. This is dark lighting and this is bright lighting. Lenses can also create problems in acquisition. You have spherical aberrations, coma aberrations and chromatic aberrations. We are not going to go into the details of the physics of lens assembly and how these can be corrected, but they make for very, very interesting reading. I would recommend very highly that you should try to read up some material on this. The physics of image formation and different qualities of lenses also affect your image formation, especially when you are doing things like microscopy or you're capturing satellite images. You also have other challenges which are related to perception. We have already seen how color is perceived differently by human beings. So we have seen how the same RGB color has different RGB values, right? So the same color, this is the same color with respect to human beings, but the RGB values are different. We have also seen that the color is same for human beings, but in terms of RGB value, the distance of these two colors are closer, right? A human being will consider color number 2 to be closer to the reference color, but according to the RGB values, these two colors are closer to each other. Now, in addition to color-based perception, you have other problems as well with respect to how human beings perceive the world. According to human beings, all of these are chairs, right? But forget the RGB values, the structure of the chair itself is very different. So for instance, this chair has 4 legs and a backrest. This chair also you can kind of argue that it has 4 legs and a backrest. Here also the chair has 4 legs and backrest, but the legs are not prominent, they are not very clearly visible. This is a chair, but it doesn't have 4 legs, right? And what do you call this? Here the legs are again not very prominent, and there are different lighting and background conditions, right, in all of these images. A human being might perceive all these images to be containing chairs, but how does an image processing algorithm ignore the fact that these chairs have shadows, that there is grass in these images, whereas there is no grass in these images, and that the more important part are the chairs in these images, right? So if you asked a person what is common across these 5 images, promptly they would be able to respond, there are chairs in these images. But for you to be able to train a computer vision or an image processing algorithm to be able to do this is tough. There could be many other objects that are in the background. I could show you a chair, which is, for example, instead of being in a garden, I could show you a chair in a drawing room or in a bar, and you would have to separate all of these out and figure out what is the common object. Similarly, handwriting and machine print, we have already seen this example earlier when we discussed image to text form of applications. We also discussed these, which are perception related challenges. It's the same person, different ages, different dresses, and while human beings can easily perceive what are the changes, it's very difficult for you to train a machine learning algorithm to do this. Some of these references would make for very interesting reading to understand how these images are generated, what are the different kinds of perception challenges in image processing. We also saw that there could be errors that are introduced due to encoding and storage. We studied the problem of image compression earlier. we said that image compression leads to lesser storage space, right? It reduces the memory that is required to store an image. But compressing the image too much might lead to loss of detail as well. So for instance, the third image has a lot of loss of detail. So you can barely read these characters, right? And you cannot read the names of the authors at all in this image. So in this lecture we have done an introduction to image processing applications. We have covered image acquisition, image representation, and we've discussed a few challenges in image processing, especially acquisition related challenges, perception related challenges, and challenges related to storage and transmission or the encoding of images. So thanks everyone, and I hope you have enjoyed the lecture.